It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for inviting me. Before I begin, I honor the Wichita on whose homelands we stand. While I don't speak Wichita, I do see the importance of acknowledging and honoring their history, their lives, and their culture in this space before it was occupied by us. Otherwise, it has been a pleasure to be with you for a few days on this campus, meeting people who share my interests and concerns, and of course, it is an absolute treasure to be here today as a part of this special occasion. Thank you for that. The paper that I've chosen to share with you today is a work in progress, and I am working on a larger thing. I think I need to move these big old books. Yep. So I have some room to stretch out a little bit. I like to occupy a little bit more space. There we go. Anyway, it's part of a larger project that has been anchored by the question of whether we as human beings with complex interrelationships can actually make the world a better, more just, and equitable place. And my title is Rhetorics of Hope and Care and the Search for Transformative Spaces for Action and Leadership. And of course, you're enrolled in the opportunity to do just that, to find a transformative space for action and leadership. One point of view suggests that our actions to date are at best only marginally impactful, and at worst, meaningful and ineffective over time in making a critical difference. So the challenge is whether we accept these views of our general failures and face the inevitability of destruction, or learn from various failures and search for other solutions with a clearer eye toward identifying and using resources to better effect. My desire has been to look, listen, learn, and try again. As an academic in rhetorical studies, my inclination has been to leverage our rhetorical assets to take seriously a more dynamic configuration of language and literacy, social, political, cultural, and historical knowledge, and our experiences in preparing students for citizenship and leadership. My focus has been twofold: on the need to be far more deliberative and deliberate about creating and sustaining a broader vision of possibility for humans in global context and the human enterprise, and on the need to have a firmer resolve to work vigilantly toward functioning both responsibly and innovatively within this framework. I suggest that these concerns can be characterized as an exercising of hope and care. In balancing them, the idea is to leverage their potential to position the work not as an idealistic dreamscape filled with sound and fury, but as grounded practice, the merging of thoughtfulness and action in recognition of the transformative potential to set new and arguably more impactful and effective habits and operational patterns. I'm aware that spaces that are defined in these sorts of terms are sometimes viewed as naively utopian and unrealistic. I suggest, however, otherwise, as indicated by the history of the lived experiences of African American women. Over time, this group has engaged in actions and practices that have cast light on the notion that hope is surrounded by the materialities of a complex and inhospitable world, a world in which they must survive and thrive without succumbing to the debilitating effects of their circumstances and conditions. Instead, this group of women has regularly created spaces in which they have managed to come to voice and action, keeping in mind visions of possibility in the face of the lack thereof, at the very same time that they have been deeply cognizant of the importance of doing whatever can be done. One basic point that we can extrapolate from these habits is the importance of searching for balances and counterbalances that generate inspiration, sustain energy, and commitment, and create springboards from which both ordinary and extraordinary actions, whatever they might be, can be done. So when I make these assertions, what then do I mean? Permit me to begin unpacking this perspective with a literary springboard. In her volume, Imago, science fiction writer Octavia E. Butler. Is anybody familiar with Octavia Butler? Okay, very good. She's one of my personal favorites. She creates a world where continuity and change are the subject of an amazingly imaginative and innovative dreamscape. Early in the novel, in a conversation between an Earth being and a non-Earth being, an alien, the alien states the following, and I'm quoting, "There is a lethal genetic conflict in humanity, and you know it. Your own history tells you. Your people are intelligent, and that's good. But you're also hierarchical, you and your nearest animal relatives and your most distant animal ancestors. Intelligence is relatively new to life on Earth, but your hierarchical tendencies are ancient. The new was too often put in the service of the old. It will be again. You're bright enough to learn to live on your own new world, but you're so hierarchical, you'll destroy yourselves trying to dominate it and each other. You might last a long time, but in the end, you'll destroy yourselves." And that's the end of the quotation. Obviously, the earth that she's talking about is at the point of destruction, and this is an observation that's worth noting. I add to Butler's proposition another intersection. Humans are intelligent, hierarchical, and also territorial and tribal. Our history suggests that many, if not all, humans have a tendency to acquire and hoard space, both materially and metaphorically, and things within this space, with an inclination to want exclusive rights and control over all of it for themselves, and to create markers of various kinds to signal their passion for safety, security, power, and control. We have a habit, for example, in our territorial acquisitions of fearing a deep loss if we no longer control something that we feel we own or should own. Or we feel disgruntled and out of sorts when our ability to do something without consequence or accountability is questioned or disrupted. Moreover, we have a habit of harboring a sense of disorder when we are required, by whatever circumstances, to adjust our desires within the company of others, or to trust anyone deemed other, or to share or relinquish control, ownership, or domination. We have a profound sense of discontent if our need to feel superior to others is disrupted, such that over time, we have now accumulated a considerable amount of evidence that our continuous enactments of imbalance among these traits, from the complex systems of rank and order that we have created in our societies, to the wars and conflicts that we have waged against each other, to the tensions that we've manifested and magnified in various types of cross-boundary relationships. Such evidence does indeed suggest that our intelligence, that is, our ability to use our intellectual capacities for sustaining peace and balance for all, has been deployed quite regularly in the service of our hierarchical, territorial, and tribal proclivities, and not in the interests of peace, harmony, and balance. What I'm suggesting in raising this configuration of deeply seated traits is that these particular intersections constitute lethal vulnerabilities, but they also constitute a powerful set of analytical lenses by which to interrogate the challenges that we face in fomenting global peace and prosperity. Questions that emerge are multiple. How do we even begin to resist our human tendencies to divide, rank, and conquer, to exert power and control over others, to exaggerate differences and distinctions? How do we resist the fears that creep into these processes and cause all of us angst? How do we resist the desire to find ever-invented ways to create boundaries and barriers for the protection of what is ours, as we articulate rationales for our attitudes that distinctions between us and them are just not negotiable? How do we redirect our passions away from the desire to create binaries, the need to elevate ourselves at the expense of others, the desire to dehumanize the ones that we declare as other, and to convince ourselves that we are free to treat them without the regard that we might wish and expect for ourselves? And when we do manage to perceive the complexity of this challenge, how do we resist the sometimes deafening call of nihilism? Nihilism occupies a space that turns on extreme suspicion and doubt about the integrity and viability of everything and anything. From this perspective, then, strategies that embrace a well-grounded sense of hope and care seem pointless, meaningless, useless, and essentially incapable of generating positive results or leveraging paradigmatic shifts. The language of optimism seems naive, destined to get us nowhere, and destined to leave us with no mechanism to avoid destruction and despair. One point to consider, however, is that while the powerful drift of humanity toward destruction and despair may indeed be relentless, there is simultaneously a more optimistic response to persistently disorienting conditions that make it possible for us to generate an equally relentless momentum to be vigilant in resisting such things. A basic strategy for building a resistant momentum is to strike and sustain various types of positive balances and counterbalances, with the understanding that the need for resistance is not once and done. It is ever present and ongoing, which brings doubt to the question of whether despair actually rules the day, or is just a factor that must be addressed as a residual of our lethal vulnerabilities. I suggest that the most critical challenge is neither nihilistic sensibilities nor utopian desires, but the need to sustain balance with hope and care, understanding that acts of resistance in the face of lethal vulnerabilities is quite simply not once and done. So what is a touchstone action for this perspective? A perennial one is that experience tells us that it's harder to dismiss, dishonor, and demonize people whom we've taken the time and energy to get to know, with whom we make the effort to build meaningful relationships, and with whom we interact regularly. The proposition is that opportunities for interaction become spaces that emerge in transformative ways when we set aside our disbeliefs about those who are not us and set aside our doubts about how our interests might fare in the company of others, and whether we are destined to lose or lose out if the game of life and living is not about winning. In other words, despite our disbeliefs and feelings of doubts and distrust, we could choose to pursue, as Anna Julia Cooper proclaims that we should, a gain from belief, rather than permitting doubt and despair to set the terms of engagement or non-engagement. As Cooper says, and I quote here, it is these magic words, I believe, that is power. That is the live coal from the altar, which at once unseals the lips of the dumb, and that alone which makes a man a positive and not a negative quantity in the world's arithmetic. With this potent talisman, man no longer abideth alone. He cannot stand apart, a cold spectator of earth's pulsing struggles. The flame bursts forth, the idea, the doctrine, the device for betterment must be imparted. I believe that was strength and power. Without them, I have no inspiration to better myself, no inclination to help another. She said that in 1892. The challenge is to believe in the possibility that hope, care, and vigilance as elements of an adventurous quest leverage positive change and have the capacity to yield in deliberately transformative space the materiality of balance, harmony, and peace. The question is this: if indeed we permit ourselves to believe in the benefits of hope and care, how do we make that first critical step of acknowledging more forthrightly the operational existence of our lethal genetic traits, being intelligent, hierarchical, territorial, and tribal? What does this basic acknowledgement mean? Will it mean that we are less able to justify without interrogation in our hearts, heads, backbones, and stomachs ongoing acts of violence, violation, oppression, subjugation, the exercise of power, terrorism, and destruction as default patterns of human interaction? Will it mean that we have a better chance of being less persistent in authorizing ourselves to act inhumanely among our own, that is, as humans among humans? Most provocatively of all, in the face of our current challenges, and sadly in the absence of an open and collective acknowledgement that we have lethal vulnerabilities that must be monitored, how do we begin to pay closer attention to what it means to be our human selves at the same time that we take to heart the importance of keeping these traits that we may not be able to change, at least well balanced? For example, by being culturally well informed, socially and ethically responsible, empathetic and compassionate, deliberate and deliberative in our resistance of self-destruction, by being respectful and conscious of our uses of language, by being willing to exercise the best of our human legacies as global practice. Currently, the dominant operational choice seems to be blithely enacting and normalizing imbalances rather than balances in the toxic discourses that we are creating and strengthening around us. Discourses that seem designed to calcify otherness and lethal traits, with the consequence, it seems, of exciting not only disdain and distrust metaphorically with words that kill, but more insidiously letting loose in the world an extraordinary potential for harm and for extreme acts of violence, terrorism, and destruction, especially given the ubiquitous nature in the contemporary landscape of science and technology. All of that said, in rhetorical studies, we know that we really can make different choices and engage in different decision-making processes. We begin with the notion that words matter. The frameworks that we articulate and the narratives that we tell matter, such that in rhetorical studies specifically, we have an uber challenge before us. When we look rhetorically at our contemporary context and recognize the visceral linkages among our words, human traits, socio-political, cultural preferences, habits, and actions, a core question is whether we really are hidebound to normalize toxicity and hidebound to place ourselves quite inevitably on pathways towards self-destruction, despite being intelligent. My own hope, anchored by the actual embrace of our being intelligent, is that this trait is our sorcerer's stone, and that our intelligence enables the privilege of free will. If we can exercise the will to forge and sustain harmony and peace, rather than our tendencies to self-destruct, then we are not hidebound. We can certainly take as a given the history of humans on Earth. We cannot ignore our tendencies toward self-destruction. They are indeed real. What is also real, however, is that we have a simultaneous history of tendencies to seek balance, to create harmonies, to forge peace, as illustrated by iconic figures such as Mahatma Gandhi, Martin Luther King Jr., Mother Teresa, Fannie Lou Hamer, Nelson Mandela, and a long list of other famous leader activists, and many who are not famous. From my perspective, we really do have intellectual capacity, and this capacity really does enable the privilege of free will. We have still opportunities and even obligations in the interest of self-preservation with a broader definition of self than we currently exercise, to choose balance, harmony, peace, and prosperity for all, rather than self-destruction. One specter that surrounds us, as suggested in this statement, is that we really are in grave need of a broader sense of self. And I'm suggesting here that we can use our gifts or rhetorical prowess to facilitate this process. So how do we see and understand the cultural logics that form our binaries, ground our individual, social, institutional, national, and global identities, and nourish our habitual behaviors? How do we recast operational protocols with the goal of helping humanity to survive and thrive on Earth, our small and quite fragile blue planet, or at the very least, to survive and thrive longer? My perspective, given the work that I do in research and scholarship, is that our frameworks for positive action must necessarily be deliberately constructed amid an acknowledgement of our hierarchies and binaries. They must be courageously and persistently operated. They must also be systematically monitored and critiqued for the integrity of their operational pattern if we expect to have a chance of survival that speaks not to our worst enactments of humanity, but to the best of both the legacies of the human enterprise on Earth and our untapped potential for creating better balances for ourselves as humans going forward. I am suggesting that we can begin addressing these tasks rhetorically with our stories. One example is a binary that we need to question. One example of a binary that we need to question is the notion of the barbarian, recognizing, first of all, that it is actually a myth, a thematic narrative that we have created as human beings who are intelligent and also hierarchical, territorial, and tribal. We made the concept up. However, when we look rhetorically over time and territory at the conceptual space within which the idea of the barbarian narrative has been enacted, the more complex problem is not the myth, but the mythos that it has engendered. The myth may be false, but the mythos is painfully real. According to Merriam-Webster's dictionary, a basic definition of mythos is that it is a pattern of beliefs expressing, often symbolically, the characteristic or prevalent attitude in a group of culture or culture. The term invokes custom, legend, lore, recurring narrative themes, the primacy of tradition in accounting for practices of various kinds, the power of habits. From this perspective, the term barbarian is not tied so much to fact or truth. After all, as one example, African Americans are not non-human, as this narrative was put forward a few years back. With regard to to fact, what we have come to know scientifically, biologically, anthropologically, sociopolitically about humans around the globe is that across space, time, condition, cultural practices, and superficial characteristics, for example, skin color as a physical marker of difference, is that despite the appearance of various differences, human beings are quintessentially the same, and that there is considerable evidence, including now the gene pool, that all of us likely descend from common ancestors. So how do we come to the concept of barbarian as the symbolic representation of our tendencies to create hierarchies, in this case, in the definition of who is human, and hierarchically also who is worthy, even within the scope of human, to be entitled to our invented gradations of rationality to exercise power and authority in the world. According to the Oxford English Dictionary, the term barbarian comes from ancient Greek, and at its core refers to people who did not speak the Greek language and whose language was perceived by them through the sound, ba 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 ba, like barbarian, with the division being marked as Greek and non-Greek, citizen and non-citizen, belonging to the group and not belonging, sounding different, acting different, looking different from a different place. In addition, during this era, the term extended also to include pejorative political divisions among Greek states during times of war between Greek allies and non-Greek allies, all with an increasingly pejorative viewpoint, including references such as ignorant, cowardly, uncivilized, inferior, wild, savage, and so on. By the Roman era, barbarian, which originally defined the Romans themselves, came to be considered as those who lacked Greek and Roman culture. For example, as typically the positioning for the enslaved in that culture, and those who lived outside of anointed civilized territory, especially those outsiders who were threatening the Roman Empire from the north and the east. With regard to the power struggles of war, these non-Greco-Romans were positioned as uncivilized people attacking civilized ones, and they were increasingly associated with brutality, savagery, and with people deemed to be inferior as crude, uneducated, unrefined, and not conforming to the prevailing dominance of Greco-Roman culture. With the rise of Christianity, this mythological expression of cultural beliefs in the barbarian expanded to include another binary, Christians and non-Christians, with an escalating sociocultural investment in what this wave of humans considered to be the rightful dominance of Western beliefs, practices, and traditions over all else, assigning to others, but not to themselves, brutality, savagery, and hedonism, and with an apparent push over subsequent centuries to dehumanize those who did not match in various ways, to devalue their ways of being and doing, and increasingly not to notice the economic imperatives for creating and sustaining such binaries. Currently, barbarian encompasses the pejorative nuances of otherness, alienness, those who do not belong within our circle and are unworthy of care and compassion, unworthy of justice or even respect, essentially those who are not us. Over the centuries, these hierarchies and binaries have been deeply culturally encoded as rationalities for actions. For example, as indicated by the Christian Crusades or the invasions around the globe of one nation over other people's nations, or the regular instances of genocide, or the desire to build impenetrable border walls, or in terms of the research that I do, the long-lasting operations, impacts, consequences of the transatlantic slave trade and its legacies. My effort here is to underscore the point that our mythologies inform our relationships with others, condition us to set aside truths and possibilities for engagement in the face of our hierarchical, territorial, and tribal fabrications, and place all of us on a slippery slope to self-destruction in creating distrust, animosities, a language of non-engagement, and other binaries that feed division, discord, adversarial relationships, and ultimately destruction. In rhetorical listening, identification, gender, and whiteness, Krista Radcliffe discusses the analytical frameworks in rhetorical studies that help us to understand our discourses by standing under them, to be awash in their meanings, so that we listen with intention rather than for intentions to the language used and to how it has impact and consequence for others. She concentrates on terms of engagement that help to enable a more robust critical perspective that is capable of informing the ways in which we interact with others. In feminist rhetorical studies, Gisa and I have a similar goal in creating analytical topologies for broadening and deepening rhetorical understanding and enhancing excellence in research and practice. I note here that both of these analytical efforts raise to bolder relief operational definitions for critical thinking, which I define in this way: the ability to see what is there and not there, to stand back reflectively and reflexively, to be able to imagine what could be there instead, while taking deliberately into account the impacts and consequences of social hierarchies, the need for information drawn from multiple perspectives and experiences, the need to understand human and non-human beings in context, the imperative of caring for the earth as a fragile ecosystem that supports the future of life. Simply stated then, developing a new operational paradigm for human behavior on the earth depends on our enhancing our capacity to use our critical assets better and more coherently than we have in the past, to listen, to normalize a robust critical perspective, to speak with consciousness and caring. In emphasizing rhetorical listening as a key critical asset in our deliberations and interactions, Radcliffe focuses on the importance of understanding cultural logics, defining the concept in this way: a cultural logic is a belief system or way of reasoning that is shared within a culture. The definition, of course, resonates closely with the conceptual space occupied by mythos. So permit me to summarize then the cultural logics that I'm defining in this analysis. Human beings are intelligent, hierarchical, territorial, and tribal. Our intelligence is often spent in the service of our hierarchical, territorial, and tribal proclivities. The cultural logics of such processes, informed by our mythological narratives, anchor our beliefs, identities, and actions. The notion of the barbarian in the dividing of humans into variations of us and them is a myth that is not rooted in fact, but the mythos of it, in being deeply embedded now in our belief systems, is a way of thinking that we have made real. This materiality for our mythological frameworks, as it critically informs operational patterns, must be addressed in order to shift cultural practices toward a different operational paradigm. A shift in an operational paradigm is in effect a leap of faith in possibilities over perils, an act of courage and will, an act of intelligent beings, in this case, beings who choose to use their intelligence in the service of peace and global prosperity as processes that cannot be enacted very effectively as hierarchical or territorial or tribal enterprises. In other words, human history suggests that the achieving of peace and global prosperity seems linked not to human nature, but to human deliberation. We need to take the time to think and discuss our views and concerns with others in decision-making processes. Given our lethal human traits, deliberation at its best functions to nourish critical thinking and to enhance and often disrupt patterns and habits so that we can see what's going on, sort through details, think about what we are doing and not doing and why, and figure out how to balance our inclinations with an arc toward harmony, peace, justice, and prosperity for all. Obviously, I don't have time to go into much more detail than that, but I suggest that the assets that I'm highlighting, rhetorical listening, robust critical thinking, speaking with consciousness and caring, and being deliberate and deliberative in decision-making, are basic tools capable of generating spaces for positive change and innovation. I venture to say, for example, that with our habits of using tools in research and practice in feminist rhetorical studies is participating actively in disrupting hierarchies, binaries, and default frameworks. One quite promising idea that has emerged from this work is that the process of shifting an operational paradigm will likely not be leveraged by creating a negative contrast, as in anti-intelligent, anti-hierarchical, anti-territorial, and anti-tribal, but instead by creating a positive one. Consider the effect of interrogating some binaries and contrasts that aren't exactly what we typically think of as direct opposites, while we consider also the opportunities for rethinking and shifting frameworks that such an approach creates. Examples. The opposite of fear is not courage, but rather the idea that something else is more important than fear. For example, love. The opposite of love is not hate, but indifference. The opposite of indifference is listening. The opposite of courage is despair. Those are examples. Consider then what might happen if we concentrated on just 3 interventions. And I won't spend a lot of time explaining them. I'll just list them out, and anybody who wants to talk about the way I'm looking at them, feel free to talk to me about it. 1, to do better, we need clearer renderings of the character and characteristic of leadership. So one thing is that you must know that I'm twirling right now with what's going on with our nation's leadership. 2, to be better, we need more generative models of engagement and accountability. 3, to do better, we need to reconsider what it means to be human, not just as humans among humans, but a broader consideration of what it means to be human in a universe where humans are not always at the center. What would happen if we perceived ourselves as intricately interwoven with our physical world, as connected with and dependent on the earth and its materialities, rather than as dominant over it? What if humans were not the center, but just one resource among a range of animate and inanimate resources, and one among a range of sentient beings, not just humans? How might a shift in perspective of the earth as a material space in which humans are part of the ecological system rather than controlling it, and so forth and so on? The last question, of course, is whether we have the courage, the love and the caring for humanity and home, and the commitment to engage consciously and deliberately in these types of systematic recalibrations with the expectation that there is potential for moving the balance point away from toxicity and self-destruction and toward care, empathy, compassion, respect, justice, harmony, peace, prosperity, and hope as global concepts. So just so you know, I'm all in for doing these types of things. And what I hope is that some of you are too.
we also have some microphones we're looking for. But in the meantime, if you can just vocalize your question loudly, I will be able to hear. Oh, here we go. Just raise your hand, we'll come around the microphone.
I just wore you completely out with my line. That's okay. It doesn't have to be a question, it can be a comment or an observation, a doubt or a belief.
This challenge, getting people to see humans as not the center of the universe. Where do you start? How do you break that ice?
Well, I think we have to start young because our habits get set early. With children who are entering the system now. But the least that we can do with the old heads like myself is have conversations where we're asking tough questions and asking people to think about what they believe, what they do, how they practice, where all those things come from. I think that if we don't try, we're never going to do it. And we just have to try. So as I have been saying constantly here, I don't have a magic wand for how to bring success. I just think that there are some questions that deserve our serious engagement with, and that's one of them. What can you say to other people that would help them see in a non-egocentric way that there are other ways to think about ourselves as people in the universe? And that there are other ways to think of others as humans on the earth. And that there are other ways of thinking about what it means to bring peace. Because on some really superficial level, it shouldn't matter what we look like, where we grew up, how much money we have. All those things should just be details that feed our experiences, certainly, but don't control the way that we interact with everybody. Yes?
Thank you so much, Dr. Royster. I was wondering if you would expand a little bit more on your idea about accountability and how that might function towards bringing some sort of harmony. I find sometimes that notions of harmony and, connectedness of humans ends up becoming like color-blind racism, or is like co-opted into another sort of narrative that doesn't appreciate difference. And so I'm really interested in how you see accountability functioning as potentially a stopgap for that.
Well, I think we have to really give some serious thought to what we call accountability measures. Because my sense of the need for accountability is not whether people match up to some prescription that we have created. That is what replicates the problem. Okay, this is what we know you ought to be, this is where you are, this is where that is, you fail, you're different, you don't count. That's not what I mean. But when you're talking about people engaging in decision-making processes of various kinds, whether they are about nations or about community actions or whatever, what is considered then as the impact and consequence of those actions? How do you hold your feet to the fire? Now, I hate to be specific and say here that you have a moment of accountability that you're facing, and that students here have been very clear about some things that they are concerned about. How is this institution going to be accountable to having heard that? What are you going to do? What kind of response are you going to have? How do you match up your responses with their needs? And to me, that's a different kind of accountability structure.
Thank you.
Thank you for your words, first off. But one of the things I wrote down that I have heard said in other venues is the idea of us and them is a myth, and you were very eloquent afterwards. My question for you is this: when you're out in the world and that moment comes where you say the idea of us and them or me and you is a myth, what's the next sentence after that?
Who are you?
Thank you.
I think that, again, it's that prescriptive thing. We box ourselves in by that kind of binary instead of discovering who is in the room with us, who stands before us, who are we, and having that generate a different kind of conversation. I don't have to rank and file you, which is what the us and them typically does. But it's nice to know how you bring forward your details so I can have a sense of, oh, that's interesting. Or, oh, I see. I would like to know more about that. And respecting one human to another, the fact that, there are differences in the world, but they don't have to be us-them differences.
Dr. Royster?
Yes, sir.
Thank you. Okay. Yes? Okay. Thank you for your talk. This is wonderful. I really appreciate you're using Octavia Butler as your springboard, and it's interesting the moment in the text that you point us to, this moment of thinking about new world building and creating. Do you think that so much of that hierarchy is already built into this world that it requires a new world to start anew? Or do you see this as something that's, and if we are able to end those kind of hierarchies, will it create its own new world?
Well, I think that we're looking for what is glibly called in some other circles a third space that is a new paradigmatic way of looking at the space that you have. But there are days when I like to think that I could go somewhere else and just start again. Leave a bunch of folks behind so you can have that one. I want this one, and I want you to stay away from here. But that is something that we have to resist because it puts us in the same place where we always were. Now, my fear, and I still have fears, is that we've waited an awful long time to start trying some of these things. And some of us are so ingrained with the ugliness of what it has meant to be human that it just seems an insurmountable task. At the same time, what I know is in smaller scope, that I would not be standing here today if there had not been women and men who believed in the possibility of my standing here. So I have to believe in the possibility that we can do something better than we're doing right now. If I believe that, then it's people like Anna Julia Cooper and Ida Wells who say, if you believe it, then you have to do something. So the question is, what are you going to do? Now, where I get hope these days is from the young people that I meet in these colleges and universities. The people that I met the other day in Dr. Kennard's class, they give me hope because they're thinking so much better than I did at that age. There is a chance that we have someone who can think outside of the old paradigms, to imagine different kind of relationships, to see that we really could do something other than build walls and make big guns and use them to kill people. We can do something other than that. The trick is to try to figure out what is it that we can do? And like I said, I don't have any magic answers to that. But given the research that I've done on women who should have been hopeless about their lives and were not, I could not possibly be hopeless about the possibility. I think that we can make a better earth.
Dr. Royster?
Yes.
Let's have one more question.
Okay. Could you talk a little bit more about, I'm sorry, this thing is not working very well, at least in my hands. Could you talk a little bit about the role of comparative work, whether it is in languages or in cultures? You've traveled so far, particularly in Africa. And some of what you described is very familiar to me, for example, from Vedanta philosophy. whether it's traveling back in time or traveling across the globe. And that's not to say that one culture is better than the other, but there are sets of ideas of different ways of being.
Mm-hmm.
And language is a very important, literacy is a very important vehicle for that, I believe with you. So would you speak a little bit about that, please?
Well, there are lots of things to be said about that, I think. And the most concrete one for me, it has been my support over these last years that I've been at Georgia Tech for our study abroad programs. Because it becomes evident that with students who have never set foot out of the state of Georgia, who have the opportunity to spend substantive time in culture somewhere else, they come back with eyes that are more open than when they left, with a deeper appreciation of ways of being, doing, seeing, and believing than when they left. And so that tells me there's something about that listening, that discovering, that interacting that is very valuable to human beings. If you stay in your little box all the time, how are you going to know that there's anything else to be, to do, to think, to believe? Now, you don't have to believe everything you meet. You don't have to love everything you see. But at least it gives you a broader swath of what there is out there and how it can be appreciated. So you look at the cultures of India that are so ancient, and you wonder about anybody in the United States thinking that they should have control over anything. Y'all too young. You haven't been around long enough. What do you know? I mean, why can't we learn from each other? Why can't we see these humans over here did it this way? These humans over here did it this way. There may be some things that we can learn from their doing of it that would help us decide in this third space that we're so in need of what we might do now. And now, especially since the world has gotten so small, people don't stay home anymore. They never did, really, but they certainly don't now. There is mobility. There is the opportunity for confrontation, clash, or connection. How do we do that? Without charging anybody for being different, for choosing different, for having different circumstances. So, to me, language and culture are a gift that helps us to see the possibility of what might be, with that definition that I gave you about critical thinking. What's there, what's not there, what could be there instead. And we're looking for, what could be there instead? Because the real challenge is, now that we are together, what could be here instead?
Thank you very much for your time.